The desert sun sinks low over the American Southwest, turning the dust into a copper haze that settles on abandoned chrome like a final judgment. In that wavering heat, beneath a faded canvas tarp, something waits, long, low, and unmistakably regal. A crown time chose to forget. A sudden gust lifts the corner. Two-tone paint catches the light. Chrome flashes like lost jewelry. The proud sweep of a fender reveals a moment when designers believed America's future could be shaped in steel. The 1956 Mercury Medalist doesn't roar. It exhales, soft, weary, almost relieved. It was born as Mercury's quiet declaration of independence, described in 1956 by the Detroit Free Press as a fresh stride toward prestige, standing between Ford's practicality and Lincoln's luxury. Priced to challenge Buick and Oldsmobile, engineered with discipline rather than noise, it deserved far more attention than it received. And yet today, almost no one remembers it. To understand the Medalist, one must return to a moment when America was swelling with post-war confidence. Eisenhower was halfway through his first term. Suburbs spread like a new kind of frontier. Families wanted more chrome, more horsepower, more promise in their driveways. Ford Motor Company felt those tremors deeply. Mercury, once the rebellious middle child, had drifted too close to Ford, below and too far from Lincoln above. Dealers complained of identity confusion. Executives whispered that the brand risked fading into the limbo between affordability and aspiration. So in 1955, behind glass office walls in Dearborn, a plan took shape. The Medalist would be Mercury's reset button, a model that distilled the brand to its essentials. No excess trim packages, no inflated pricing. A pure, bold, entry-level Mercury that still carried the heft of the name. Internal memos from the period described it as a gateway to Mercury ownership, not a compromise of Mercury values. The company needed something to widen its net, especially against GM's relentless spread of mid-price models. Buick had bulk. Oldsmobile had swagger. Even Pontiac was stirring with new ideas. Mercury needed something simple, but not plain, affordable, but not ordinary. So they built a car with the stance of a fighter and the manner of a diplomat. The Medalist stretched more than 206 inches, its body pressed into a clean, straight-roof silhouette that carried forward the optimistic geometry of mid-50s Detroit. Designers gave it the sculpted rear quarters that had become Mercury's signature, paired with a broad mesh grille and chrome brows over twin headlights that looked like watchful eyes. Period brochures called its profile the new balanced Mercury look, an attempt to ground its styling in proportion rather than flamboyance. It was a car that promised command without aggression, but beneath the bright work lay the true story. A newly refined Mercury Y-Block V8, 312 cubic inches, fed by a 4-barrel carburetor that Motor Trend described as quietly authoritative in its torque delivery. Factory manuals boasted of thicker cylinder walls, redesigned water passages, and sturdier bearings meant to survive the kind of heat that punished lesser engines. With the optional Merc-O-Matic automatic transmission, the Medalist glided with a confidence that reviewers praised for its smoothness, though some noted that the throttle response hid more muscle than Mercury wanted to brag about in advertisements. A forgotten luxury muscle car, modest in price, but not in presence. Inside the cabin, the Medalist revealed the quiet ambition Mercury tried so hard to disguise. The door closed with a dense, deliberate thud, a sound that Roden Track, in a brief 1956 note, called more Lincoln than Ford. The steering wheel wore a deep dish safety design, ringed by chrome that caught the sunlight like jewelry. The dash swept across the interior in a horizontal plane of painted metal and ribbed aluminum trim, punctuated by round gauges that glowed softly at night. Even the base upholstery, vinyls and woven fabrics stitched in geometric mid-century patterns, felt warmer and more confident than the price point suggested. The cabin carried the faint optimism of an America learning to celebrate comfort. Heater controls were redesigned for smoother travel. Ventilation ducts were repositioned to reduce draftiness. And for those who checked the right boxes, power windows, a four-way power seat, and the famed Seat-O-Matic memory feature were all available. It was Mercury's attempt to democratize luxury, to give the working-class father of three the chance to drive something that looked, felt, and behaved like a smaller Lincoln. The chassis underneath was equally deliberate. Mercury engineers widened the track slightly over Ford's, stiffened the springs, and paired them with softer bushings to balance stability with long-distance comfort. Popular mechanics noted during a 1956 test run that the suspension absorbs washboard pavement with a composure few cars in its bracket can match. The Medalist didn't float. It settled, and when driven with a steady hand, it carved the new interstates with surprising grace. Yet even as Mercury polished its entry-level gem, the Medalist faced an enemy it could not outrun: competition from its own family. Ford's Fairlane Victoria, wearing the glamour of the Crown Victoria roofline and priced slightly lower, lured buyers upward from basic sedans. Lincoln, newly invigorated after its Carrera Panamericana wins, commanded aspirational shoppers. And GM, Detroit's immovable mountain, offered Buick Special, Oldsmobile 88, and Chevrolet Bel Air, each armed with aggressive marketing and massive dealer networks. The Medalist fought quietly in the shadows of louder siblings. Mercury positioned it as the sensible Mercury, a phrase repeated in brochures that felt more apologetic than triumphant. Dealers often upsold customers into the pricier Montclair or Monterey, where commissions were sweeter. The Medalist, despite its clean lines and stout engineering, became the car you were gently steered away from, not toward. By late 1956, production numbers reflected that reality. The Medalist Coupe and sedan sold in respectable but forgettable quantities, numbers that internal Ford reports considered within projections, but far from breakout success. The Medalist was performing the duty it had been assigned, not the destiny it secretly deserved. And with the 1957 model year moving toward more flamboyant fins, more chrome, more spectacle, Mercury executives made a quiet decision. The Medalist, this carefully engineered gateway, would live only a brief life. 1 year, one attempt, one shot at redefining Mercury's foundation. Then it would disappear. Not with scandal and not with failure. Just absence. The kind that happens when a car exists in a moment too crowded with giants. But its story does not end in 1956. Time, cruel to many machines, was oddly gentle with the Medalist. Because while America moved on to flashier silhouettes, a small number of these cars slipped into barns, carports, desert yards, and the private corners of rural America, where mechanical loyalty is valued more than fashion. They aged quietly, waiting for rediscovery. Some were found decades later with sun-cracked dashboards, oil-stained service tags dangling from the steering column, and odometers frozen at numbers that suggested a life spent on long, unhurried highways. Others were rescued from barns where they had been parked beside aging tractors, their chrome dulled, but their bones intact. Each rediscovery carried a strange emotion. like opening a time capsule sealed before the world, learned the word futuristic. Collectors who knew Mercury's lineage understood immediately what they had stumbled upon. The Medalist was not a flashy creature by the standards of its era, but beneath the restrained styling, restorers found the unmistakable presence of Ford engineering at its most deliberate, a Y-block built to work tirelessly, thick steel that resisted fatigue, and craftsmanship that rewarded patience. It was a car built with quiet confidence, not desperation. And those who drove restored medalists often described the same sensation. A calm eagerness in the steering, a weight that settled into the road rather than floating above it. A V8 that did not shout but pulled with steady determination. In an age of tail fins and speedline marketing, the Medalist had been engineered for a subtler purpose: to endure the long American distance. Today, that trait makes it feel strangely modern. As restorers studied the surviving factory literature, they found small clues about Mercury's intentions. Engineering bulletins emphasized heat management, long life bearings, improved lubrication routes. Details aimed not at weekend races, but at families planning cross-country trips. Frame diagrams showed reinforced front crossmembers designed to dampen vibration on the new high-speed turnpikes. Even the Merc-O-Matic's shift points were calibrated to keep the Y-block in its thick, reassuring torque band. It was, in many ways, a luxury muscle car in disguise, power wrapped in manners. Yet that hidden strength was exactly what doomed it. The Medalist lived in the space between categories, too refined to be a bargain Ford, too understated to challenge a Buick Super, too quietly competent to become a cultural icon. It was a car that deserved clarity, but was born into confusion, a machine with no enemy to defeat and no myth to carry. The automotive press barely noticed its disappearance, buried as it was under the tidal wave of tailfin extravagance sweeping into 1957. For decades, the Medalist slipped through the cracks of memory. Classic car guides devoted more space to its siblings. Auction catalogs rarely mentioned it, and when they did, the tone was polite but brief, as though describing a guest who arrived at the party dressed impeccably, but left before anyone remembered to ask their name. But time has a strange way of rewriting hierarchy. In recent years, collectors seeking the unpolished truths of mid-century Detroit have begun to look back, past the icons, past the headline cars, past the museum pieces, to machines that carried the weight of real American roads. The Medalist now sits at the quiet edge of that rediscovery, rare enough to be desirable, honest enough to feel authentic, forgotten long enough to seem mysterious. When one emerges at an estate sale or small-town auction, older mechanics drift toward it first, drawn by instinct. They recognize the stance, the generous engine bay, the geometry of the frame. They know what it is without needing to read the emblem. They remember when cars like this were built for the long haul, for the trusted miles between towns, for families who measured value in durability rather than glamour. The Medalist was never meant to be a star, but the road always remembers those who served it faithfully. And so the story bends toward its quietest chapter, the part where memory fades and only echoes remain. The 1956 Mercury Medalist never claimed headlines. It never terrified rivals, never won high-profile trophies, never wore fins sharp enough to wound the air. It simply carried its weight with dignity through a year when the automotive world demanded louder gestures. And because it refused to shout, history forgot to listen. But forgotten machines have a way of leaving fingerprints. Look closely at Mercury's later successes: the muscular Monterey of the early 60s, the confident stance of the marauder, and you can see the medalist's blueprint buried beneath the styling flourishes. A wider track here, a more composed ride there, an insistence on merging strength with civility. The medalist was not a star, but it was a foundation stone, one laid so neatly that no one noticed how much it supported. Today, when a surviving medalist steps into the light, it brings with it a strange, cinematic stillness. These cars do not burst back to life. They return like artifacts, carrying the texture of the time that shaped them. You see it in the contour of the fenders, in the disciplined sweep of the roofline, in the honest engineering that hides beneath the polished air cleaner. You feel it when the Y-block turns over, a deep, deliberate rotation, as though the engine must first remember the decade it was built for. Owners of restored medalists often speak of the same moment. The first night drive, windows down, instrument lights glowing with that soft green mercury hue, the road unwinding in front of them like an old film reel. And somewhere between the hum of the tires and the steady pulse of the V8, they feel the presence of a car that never got its due, a car that tried to stand tall during a year when the market wanted spectacle instead of strength. The medalist's rarity today is not the result of extravagance, but of circumstance. It lived briefly, sold modestly, and then stepped aside before the spotlight turned back toward Mercury's more flamboyant offerings. That brevity has become its mystique. At modern car meets, it draws a different kind of crowd, not the thrill seekers, but the listeners, the ones who lean in, run a hand across the chrome, and realize they're standing in front of something deliberately built, yet rarely spoken of. Every old machine leaves behind a question. The medalist's is simple. How many other deserving creations vanished not because they failed, but because they arrived in the wrong moment? In that question lies the melancholy heart of mid-century American automotive history, a landscape filled not just with icons, but with ghosts. The 1956 Mercury Medalist is one of those ghosts, a quiet achiever, a restrained muscle car, a luxury sedan that tried to balance ambition with humility. And in its silence, it became more haunting than many cars that shouted their way into the record books. If stories like this resonate with you, feel free to leave a comment, like, and subscribe. There are many more forgotten machines waiting in the shadows. See you next time.